Welcome back to the road to the cross. The garden was not just a place of prayer. It was a place of deep sorrow. In this episode, we continue in the garden as Jesus enters fully into suffering, facing the loneliness of his hour. Steve and Tim walk through the agony of this moment, revealing the love that carried him forward to the cross. This is episode 5, A Man of Sorrows.
Well, welcome back to the Impact Nations podcast. My name is Tim. I am your host. I'm here with Dad. You can call him Steve. And we are picking right back up where we left off last week in the garden. And I don't know why, but I just was suddenly reminded of, remember the old Batman show in the 60s? They give you the summary at the beginning, where we last left Batman or whatever. Anyway.
I've really tried to erase that from
that show was brilliant.
My junior high school memory.
Pow, Biff, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, we are picking right back up where we left off. We're in the garden, and I'm curious because last week we started by reading that episode from Matthew, I believe it was.
Yep.
But I look at my notes here today, and you've got us starting in Hebrews.
I do.
What's that about?
Stay tuned.
Oh, the suspense.
I'm just picking up on the Batman theme. Just for that, I'll let you read these two verses.
Absolutely.
They're Hebrews 5, verse 7 and 8.
All right. It says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered.
Yeah, powerful passage.
What an interesting phrase, in the days of his flesh.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, interesting, huh? Well, let me start with a quote from one of the Cappadocian fathers. There were 3 of them, 2 Gregories and a Basil. And we'll start with Gregory.
That sounded like the beginning of a joke. 2 Gregories and a Basil walk into a bar.
We're off to a rough start. This is St. Gregory of Nazianzus.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, it isn't. Nazianzus. Connected with this general view are the facts that he learned obedience through what he suffered, his loud cries and tears, the fact that he offered up prayers. These things are marvelously constructed drama dealing with us. As the form of a servant, which is a quote from Philippians 2, he comes down to the same level as his fellow servants. He bears the whole of me, along with all that is mine in himself, so that he may consume within himself the meaner element, as fire consumes wax or the sound ground mist. I think I've got a typo there, but anyway, as the way mist is, as the sun ground mist, and so that I may share in what is his through the intermingling. So here in the garden is the mystery of the incarnation, which we're going to move in and out of that theme throughout this whole series on the road to the cross. As a man, Jesus is feeling the fear and anguish in the face of death. But he's also feeling the distress of the Son of God, who sees the terrible accumulation of evil that he must take upon himself in order to overcome it. The truth is that Jesus has a choice. We mustn't forget that. This is not all just preordained and he has no choice. In an instant, the Father could have delivered Jesus. Remember what he said to Pilate. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But Jesus yielded his human will to the divine will. He chose to enter fully into the human condition, and this includes death, which we're going to talk a lot more about as we actually get to the crucifixion. So there's about 3 main themes today. The first is sorrow. In fact, I often think of this whole episode as being about the man of sorrows. Since the expulsion from the first garden, which we talked a lot about last week, sorrow is part of the universal human condition. When the fall happened, Genesis 3, it introduced sadness unto death. Christ's first words to Eve after the fall, where I will greatly multiply your sorrow. And it isn't him punishing. This is the outcome of your choice. When Jesus enters this garden, he returns to the place where the man and the woman fell. And now he takes their sorrow, which he had pronounced in Genesis 3, upon himself. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Jesus' self-emptying, just for those who weren't listening last week, this is kenosis. It was not easy. It wasn't some kind of a legal contract. It was so powerfully experiential. Gethsemane was, first of all, a place of sadness. Isaiah, writing hundreds of years earlier, wrote about this moment. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. That's in the New Living Translation, by the way, which I don't refer to that often, but it was really clear. I see the garden as the entry point of Christ's fullest identification with us. We are witnessing the increasing weight of the existential sorrow that is on all human mankind, and now it's bearing down upon Christ, upon Jesus. The scripture never shies away from Jesus' deep and very human anguish. In the days of his flesh, Hebrews 5:7, going back there, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. I think I mentioned last week that St. Ephrem and St. Ambrose both gave an awful lot of attention to what took place in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let me just give you a fairly lengthy St. Ambrose quote. It was for me that he was afflicted. As regards himself, there was no need for him to suffer affliction, but he put to one side his enjoyment of eternal divinity and let himself be attacked by the weakness of my infirmity. He took on himself my sadness, my depression, so that he might lavish on me his own joy. In our footsteps, he followed all the way down to the anguish of death. In this way, he chose that we should follow upward in his footsteps and be restored to life. You know, something just jumped out at me right now. He took on himself my sadness and my depression so that he might lavish on me his own joy. For a long time, I've been aware that in the church tradition that I was a part of for so long, we were so much about living victoriously that we denied depression. We should basically get over it.
You don't have enough faith, or you're not praying enough, or something. Because there shouldn't be depression in the kingdom.
There shouldn't be, but there is in humanity. There is in life. And I think it is very harmful to deny depression. I'll go right out on a limb that I had no idea I was going to go out on. There are even some who say, well, Christians should never take antidepressants. That's ridiculous. Christians with heart trouble should never take heart medicine. Christians who are fighting cancer should never take treatment. We've somehow distorted this because we're so afraid of it. We're so afraid of what I believe is part of the existential human condition of feeling alienated at times, of feeling lonely at times, of fighting depression at times. So I just wanted to say that because it jumped out at me from Ambrose.
You said something last week that struck me, which was talking about the full range of emotions that Jesus experienced. And you just said, because we're afraid of it. And in one sense, as he was crying out with loud cries and supplications, as the writer to Hebrews says here, and as we read from the account in Matthew last week, in one sense, is that not Jesus actually processing his own fear of having to encounter our depression, our sorrow?
Absolutely.
And yet, he got over that fear and faced it just the same.
He went through to the other side. So, what are the reasons for this intensity of sorrow that begins to overwhelm Jesus? Well, the first thing I want to point out is I believe he was experiencing the accumulated force of being rejected by every generation throughout history, again and again and again. Who God really was rejected.
Yeah.
And I think he was feeling, this is about accumulation in one sense, this whole episode we're going to look at today and we did last week. Jesus also, he knew that really soon, likely within the hour, his closest friends would abandon him. He knew that he was about to experience the most torturous execution that Rome had ever devised. It's possible, and by the way, I'm going to do an episode in a few weeks of very literally what happened on the road to the cross, those from after the trial to his death. And we've got lots of other things to say, but I want to make sure that we're aware of literally, physically, and emotionally what was taking place. So that's a little teaser for down the road. So he knew he was about to experience this terrible, terrible torture. And I think it is possible, and I think it's likely, that all of these realities that cause us incredible sadness were behind his words, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." A wonderful theologian from the 20th century, Raymond Brown, he said this. He was convinced of what I just said to you. In the final days of his life in Jerusalem, as the leaders of his people showed unremitting hostility, Jesus would have struggled in prayer with God, the Father, about how his death fitted into the inbreaking of God's kingdom. It just didn't seem to make sense. I think I agree with Raymond Brown. I guess that's why I quoted him. But I think there's even something even more crushing that's pressing down on Jesus as he cries out to his Father in the garden. He is not just experiencing the rejection that the triune God has felt. He is experiencing the unbearable weight of thousands of years of mankind's pain and sin now beginning to fall on him. It's beyond our capacity to understand or imagine. All the fear, all the anger, all the wickedness, all the cruelty, all the sin without limit are beginning to be focused like this terrible laser beam upon the only one who could save us.
Yeah. I'm quite certain you're going to go into this in later episodes and things like that, but I think it's good to just revisit these things again and again because they're so huge. But in what you just said, in some of the quotes you've given us already in the first few minutes here today, there does seem to be hints at something very substitutionary about this. You took on my depression and things like that. Like all of those things that are coming on him are from the results of or just the experiences of fallen man. What role do you see in terms of substitution? Like it's a big idea in terms of like he took our place in there. Sometimes, we've talked here in this space many, many times, and we'll continue to about the difference between the two big atonement theories, which is penal substitutionary atonement and Christus Victor. And certainly our leanings, spoiler alert, is more that he was defeating the powers that be. He was defeating the powers of sin and death in the work of the cross. But the danger is that we actually throw away the word substitutionary when we're kind of leaning more towards Christus Victor and away from penal substitutionary atonement. How do you see this substitution in terms of him taking on our experience of broken humanity?
I see it in terms of identification, that he fully identifies with the human condition. And in the completeness of this identification is he he defeats its power in part by not fighting back. We'll talk about that. Because he is fully God, because he's fully man and fully God, he completely identifies, and yet he triumphs over it at the cross.
Yeah.
So substitution doesn't mean instead of me, he's a substitute, he takes everything and I don't. It's that he identifies with us.
Yeah.
So we're going to go back at that deeper, more theologically, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's really important.
Yeah, it is. And the reason I stopped you right there, because when you talked about focusing all of those things in this one moment, or, this series of moments in time, as Jesus is beginning to really experience this intensely in the garden, again, that laser focus sort of a thing. We talked last week about we bring assumptions, we bring presuppositions, we bring worldviews and theological views to the table and actually kind of put them on things that we don't even notice we're doing it. And so when I hear you using language like that, it can pretty easily slip into God's taking all of that wrath and focusing it. And what you're talking about, though, is an experience.
He's taking all that human experience,
yes,
which includes darkness,
yeah.
But that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah.
Shall we go on?
Absolutely.
Okay. Beyond our capacity, I just said that. Paul described what is ultimately indescribable.
Poor Paul trying to figure out how to tell us all this stuff, eh?
And here's how he said it. And I've heard theologians get back and forth on this all the time. It's 2 Corinthians 5:21, the first half. For our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin. The Father made the Son to be sin. And, we can go back and forth, and maybe another day we could look at even what church fathers have said and modern theologians. But the reality is, from this moment in the garden until he died hours later on the cross, Jesus was sin. He became sin for me.
I feel like we need to define that term because when you give that as such a clear statement, Jesus was sin, we better understand what we mean by sin. The literal meaning of the original word was missing the mark, which even that is open to loads of interpretation. I talked last week about N.T. Wright's strong teaching on that being about vocation and identity as God's image bearers, and missing the mark in terms of we're no longer perfectly reflecting his image. How would you define, I'm putting you on the spot, but perhaps in this context, because maybe it's different in different contexts, but when you say Jesus was sin,
Paul's trying to do it with a few words. Yeah. I think what he's saying is a little bit of what I was saying a few minutes ago. Jesus entered into the full experience of fallen man.
Yeah.
That's what I think it means.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Joseph Ratzinger again, Pope Benedict. He believes that in the midst of Christ's personal experience of sorrow, that he interceded for all of us, and therefore exercised his place as a high priest. I think it's really interesting. I almost went down this whole road. John gives us a different experience in John 17, what we call the priestly prayer. And I see real interaction, real connectedness between the synoptics in the garden and this priestly prayer. And so I agree with Ratzinger that he was interceding, and that this is, of course, what Hebrews 5, 7, and 8 is talking about, this incredible priestly intercession. So it is so much more, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, it is so much more than Jesus saying, oh, Papa, please don't make me go through this. Yeah. In fact, I don't think that's it at all. So let me give you a quote. He says, In the garden, Jesus takes up the cause of all who are struck down in the course of history. It is through his cries, his tears, and his prayers that Jesus does what the high priest is meant to do. He holds up to God the anguish of human existence. He brings man before God. And I love Ratzinger.
It's marvelous, because I was about to ask you, hey, what was the role of the priest? Because it's one, and this is done beautifully there. But I would also, interesting that phrase that Ratzinger uses there, what the high priest is meant to do. Because I think when we look at, because it's not many hours after this that Jesus suddenly has a run-in with the high priest. Like the function.
We're going to talk a lot about that
of the high priest was very warped and twisted by this point. Mm-hmm. And so again, man, I love it when it all comes together. But we're right back to vocation again.
We are. For those who love to buy books, I think I've got 2 waiting for me on the doorstep when I get home tonight. And one of them's from our dear brother Brian Zond. A book that you've read, the one about the what's he call it, Theopoetics or something. Mm-hmm. Anyway, a little plug. For those who love books, get Jesus of Nazareth. It's a 3-part hardcover. You can get it in soft, I think. It's great because Ratzinger, he had such insight into Christ. Okay?
Yeah.
That's a little by the by. I want to insert something here. Have we got time?
Yeah,
we got time to insert.
Yeah, it's our show. We can do what we want.
Let's go for pizza and we'll come back. I want to talk about this thing of sorrow, man of sorrow. And I'll just go right out on a limb. I'm wrestling so much with sorrow in these days. Really wrestling, sometimes to tears. It's certainly impacting my prayers and so forth. I'm wrestling with Gaza. You said last week that the Lord's opened some miraculous doors for us. I suspect we're getting up close to 1 million meals that we've got into Gaza. But it's not just meals. It's as I read from our friends, very personal accounts. You know, I read last week, a 9-year-old boy shot by the IDF as he went out the door to try to get water. As I look at Gaza, and I will not get political, but right now it just feels like outrage to me. I'm really, really sad. I'm not just ticked off. I'm really, really sad. The mass shootings that just don't stop and don't stop and don't stop. And the guns keep have freedom. That's really hard for me. In Ukraine, right now, what I'm hearing, I hope it doesn't happen the way, These are hard, painful, and sad days for me. So in the midst of my own personal sorrow and my anger, all I can do is lean on Jesus. I really can. That's all I can do. I can't change anything. I can pray, but he meets me in my sadness. Isaiah 30:15, in quietness and trust is your salvation. That's been as Ezra 9:8 says, a peg hold in the temple, right? I've been hearing the phrase from Isaiah 40 a lot in my head: comfort, comfort, O my people. And because of Jesus entering fully into my sorrow and your sorrow and all who will let him, I can trust his promises to never leave me and his promise to comfort me in the midst of my pain and mourning. But I got to face my pain and mourning. I can't be shallow in my prayers. Yeah. I've got to be honest with him. And when I'm able to still and quiet my soul, Psalm 131, he doesn't ignore or deny my pain. He doesn't say, there, that's fine. Yeah. He fully identifies. That's what I'm getting out of this whole Gethsemane episode. He deeply, deeply identifies with the pain of every one of those people. Yeah. Muslim, Jewish, Christian, he's with them in the pain. And that's a big part of what the cross is about. That's why we can't go substitution. Oh, he takes it all off all of us and puts it on himself. No, he identifies with us. He says, I'm here. I'm here in the darkest place. Yeah. He enters in. And he feels deep, deep pain with me, but also his unlimited, never wavering, never changing, never dying love for me. What I remember, and this is vital, is that he carries all of the world's pain and never looks away. He never looks away. And he is love. We've said that so much because only love can heal the world. But love is not a Hallmark card. It's not soft. It looks at the truth of evil and it looks directly. I want to read Isaiah 53, but this time from the Septuagint, the Greek version. He bears our sins and he suffers for us. Yet we considered him to be in pain, suffering, and ill-treated. But he was wounded because of our lawlessness, and he became sick because of our sins. And the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his bruise we are healed. It's bruising that heals us. I just think that as followers of Christ, we must believe in the power of prayer right now. We must intercede. And I don't know if my intercession changes things on the outside, but it changes things in the spirit. That I believe my intercession will bring comfort to those who mourn. And this is such a mourning time, right? Yeah. And in the midst of this, in the mystery of who he is, in the mystery of the garden, he embraces my sorrow, but going back to Hebrews, he is anointed with the oil of joy more than anyone. Yeah. He brings comfort and joy into the midst of our sorrow. He never denies our pain. He's fully there. But somehow he lives in contentment. He's not worried. And this is why he said, peace I give you, not as the world gives.
So how do we, practically speaking, transition from being real in our prayers, being real with our emotions in terms of the grief that we are feeling, very often on behalf of others? How do we look into it, be real with it, give it to him, but then move to that place of peace and joy?
The only way I know is in our complete vulnerability, in our human frailty. We need, Jesus, I need you to come now. And sometimes I just wait on him. I just wait on him. Just realized the end of Isaiah 40 days, wait on the Lord. She'll renew their strength. Just thought of that. I should have put that in the notes. By waiting and trusting and trusting and trusting. In quietness and trust is your salvation. So they who wait on the Lord, boy, that's obvious, and I never put it in my notes. But that's why I can't rush. That's why I can't have a 10-minute prayer time at the beginning of the day where I go through a checklist or whatever. I have to, in my weakness, I have to say, Lord, please, you got to come to me because these are painful days. These are painful days. You know, I don't remember a time like this, son. You know, I'm getting older. I've been through some real bad stuff, and I never remember anything like this. It's just awful. Now, mind you, I'm not old enough that I lived through the Second World War, what my parents lived through. Yeah. But within the context of me growing up in the 50s and into the 60s, this is a time. This is a time. I guess I better move on. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. I'm all the way back to Matthew 26, I just realized. Yeah. I didn't even notate that. And he said to Peter, could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Do you hear the pain in that?
Mhm.
Not anger, frustration, just pain. Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial or temptation. Again, he went away for the second time, and again he came and found them sleeping. This is the third time, for their eyes were heavy. Previously, Jesus withdrew by himself to pray. We see that all the way through, especially the synoptics. But here he did not want to be alone. And in his humanity, he was facing emotional and spiritual assault. He wanted support of his closest friends. As he went through this great time of agony and testing, he went through it alone because his friends were sleeping through it. We talked a little bit about that last week. So he faced this greatest crisis of his life alone. Again, Pope Benedict, this is one of the most dramatic moments in the mystery of our Savior. It was here that Jesus experienced that final loneliness, the whole anguish of the human condition. Here the abyss of sin and evil penetrated deep within his soul. At the deepest level, we must all face suffering alone. Even if we're surrounded by loving friends, our spouse, there's a deep, deep place that we can, while there's a certain level we can suffer with people, and that's so important, but there's an existential loneliness that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That's why we spent some time in the garden last week. I'm going to look at paradise in a later episode, but it is our true home. And in various ways, often by false substitutions, we have a longing that can only be satisfied when we arrive once again at paradise. Richard Rohr says that only two things can truly change us: love and suffering. And I've thought about that quote for almost 10 years.
Yeah.
He's got a wonderful quote: pain is the rent we pay for being human. If we will acknowledge and embrace suffering and sorrow, it will lead us to healing.
I was going to say, because there's a consequence for not. If we don't acknowledge and embrace suffering, if we just tough it out, no, I'm just going to be positive at all times, we're robbing ourselves of an opportunity for healing, for growth. I would say even for connection with fellow humans.
Yeah.
There's a real danger if you talked earlier about the church's tendency to no, we're gonna deny that depression's even possible, sort of a thing. Yeah. And if we maintain that mentality, what you and Rohr are saying here is that actually we're missing out if we don't become willing to enter into it and acknowledge it.
For more than 20 years, I've said at conferences and stuff, and I say it when I'm doing pastors' events: what is denied cannot be healed.
Yeah.
You can't heal what's denied. So it's really important, not that we wallow, but we are honest. We face it. In Luke's account in the garden, he focuses more on Jesus' agony than his sorrow. Luke 22:44. Being in anguish, he prayed more fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. So this is a unique detail that his sweat became like drops of blood.
It's kind of weird.
But it's an actual medical condition. It's very rare. I'm going to try to say it. Hematidrosis. I did it. Hematidrosis, which is the extreme dilation of the capillaries or capillaries, depending which country you're from, in the sweat glands. So it really does happen. Now, here's an interesting little point. This is the first bloodshed that takes place in the whole Passion account.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
That's the level of his suffering. Now, during the Last Supper, Jesus had said, "This cup is the new covenant established in my blood, which is shed for you." And it starts there. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the two wills and that the incarnation's on display here. Verse 39, I'm back in Matthew, going a little further. He fell on his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." As we said, probably the most famous passage of the whole Gethsemane episode. Jesus' prayer is fundamental to the whole garden account because it reveals the incarnation. We see the honest union of God and man.
Yeah.
We've talked
all
before.
Right there in one sentence.
Called hypostasis, right? And because I don't want to ignore our friend Origen, he said this, "When therefore we see in him some things as human that appear in no way to differ from the common frailty of mortals, and things so divine that they are appropriate to nothing else but the primal and ineffable nature of deity, the human understanding with its own narrow limits is baffled and struck with amazement at so mighty a wonder." Isn't that interesting? Yeah. The whole drama of our salvation hangs upon this moment. I talked a little bit of that last week. It is here that Jesus is presented with the greatest enticement he has yet faced. He is fully God, and therefore in an instant he can escape this terrible trial. And here is the temptation to seek victory without the cross. And I believe that temptation is still very real in his church, that too often we want a victorious warrior king. We've talked about that many times. We pledge allegiance to the lion rather than the lamb who was slain. Frederick Bruner wrote this: "The contemporary church is besieged by the false gospels of health, wealth, prosperity, and victory that tell us it is always possible to have bad things removed." That is preached in many places on many Sundays.
Yeah. Well, and the danger of preaching a gospel like that is that, especially initially to those who are maybe encountering Christ for the first time, is that it's not lived reality. And so very quickly they're signing up for one thing and discovering that that's not the point, and can abandon their faith because they're being promised that all your pains are going to go away or whatever. Everything will be hunky-dory.
But you know what? Even if we're not in churches that preach prosperity, we still lean toward that lion rather than lamb to say he wants to give you victory over all of these things and so forth. And I think, what I just said, I think Bruner's right. I think that it's so easy for the church to tell us that it's always possible, if you just understand the principles, if you stay faithful, for these bad things to go away.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the gospel, and certainly that's not Gethsemane. So Jesus falls before the Father, and he experiences deep and instinctive fear. Fully fear. But in spite of it, he refuses to bypass what awaits him, which he could. This is why I said it is the most critical moment in history, I said last week, and didn't really develop it because I knew I was coming to this today. Since the fall, the human will has always been distorted. It's been pulling away from God's will. It's based on the false belief that I can take control, and if I don't, it's what Satan said all the way back in Genesis 3. If I don't, I'm going to miss out on what I really want. And that's the power of the lie, and it's never changed. But as Paul has said, whatever controls you enslaves you.
Yeah.
So the irony is we want to pull away, I want freedom, and you step right into real, true slavery. It's in aligning our will with God's that we become our truest selves, what we're created to be. So we know that at the cross, Jesus broke the power of sin and death, but I think it is beginning right here at the garden. He frees us when he says, "Not my will, but thine be done." Even though I got all these things, these feelings, and it's great temptation, when he says that, he frees you and I to come into agreement with God's purposes. Because I believe in the mystery of the moment beyond time and space, I believe we are present with Jesus in his obedience right then and there.
Yeah.
Okay? And we often talk about the mystery of Christ is not bound by time and space.
Yeah.
Hebrews tells us that his obedience was not automatic because Jesus had emptied himself. Obedience was something he had to learn. Now we're at the second of those two verses in Hebrews we began with. Verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. St. Cyril of Alexandria, because there's Alexandria and Jerusalem, but St. Cyril of Alexandria, the inspired author is, so to speak, stupefied by the mystery that the Son, existing by nature truly and endowed with the glories of divinity, should so abuse himself that he endured the low estate of our impoverished humanity. But this is for us. Ambrose is saying the writer to Hebrews is just astounded by this. Let's keep pressing through. Gethsemane and the powers. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Luke 22:44. Jesus is now at the center point of his struggle. And Luke describes this as agony. I said earlier, he focuses more on that than sorrow. And he's the only writer to use this word, agonia. Agonia is the word. And it's a very strong word, meaning to struggle for victory, like a wrestling match, a severe mental struggle, and emotions, anguish. So it's a big, strong word. If the reason for his sorrow was because he was about to face a terrible and torturous death, there's something wrong. Because we've got 2,000 years of episodes of people facing death for Christ courageously. I'm always amazed. St. Ignatius, one of the earliest of the church fathers, he was martyred in 109. But they let him write all the way along as they took him to Rome. And he's writing the church. I believe it was the church in Ephesus. It might have been Antioch. I've just suddenly forgotten. But he's writing saying, don't pray for me to get free.
Wow.
He says, stop doing that because he asks them, because it was such an honor to be martyred for Christ. Don't take that honor away from me through your prayers. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So if we've got that kind of heroism.
Right, like if Ignatius could do it, why couldn't Jesus?
Yeah,
Is the implied question.
Or Dietrich Bonhoeffer or.
Sure.
So what's happening as he lays on his face in the garden? He knew that at a whole new intensified level, the kingdom of God was about to break into this earthly reality. He knew this meant that a massive cosmic struggle with the powers of darkness had now begun. Folks, get this. It's the key to understanding Gethsemane. It's to understand that he stepped into this incredible cosmic battle, warfare. And this is what's going on. And if you understand that, that will set you free forever from thinking, well, he was wrestling because he was afraid of being executed.
Yeah.
No, he entered into our fear, but this is what was really going on, this cosmic battle. Beyond Jesus' test of his will to be in total submission to the Father, this is the time and place where the final conflict begins, and its outcome will carry cosmic and eternal implications. This is why Jesus is in agony. This is why I always imagine heaven holding its breath. This is why I always see this in black and white and the powers of darkness come down. Just before he goes, he leaves the three, and when he comes back, finds them sleeping, he says the same thing. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. Now the work is periasmos, and you emphasize the mos, periasmos, which means something more dangerous than temptation. It's a trial. He's calling them to prepare for a great cosmic apocalyptic struggle between two kingdoms involving divine judgment on the dark powers. Jesus had told them that the kingdom would suffer violence. Remember he told them that way back in
it's a weird phrase.
In 11, Matthew 11:12. The kingdom's going to suffer violence, that the gates of hell would come against it. He knew that the inbreaking of the kingdom of God must involve a massive struggle with the powers. Now here in this garden is the precise place and time where God is initiating that great apocalyptic confrontation. That's what's happening. Are we lifting up this whole episode to a higher level?
So it's the pray that you may not enter temptation is not a scolding for falling asleep. It's,
This, your boys, we're coming in. This is it.
Yeah.
We're in the final. Here's the 2-minute warning. And it's a great trial, and what Jesus was doing there, among other things, in that hour with him, with the Father, he was strengthening himself in the Lord. 1 Samuel 36. I always love that. David, everything's coming down on him. He only knew one thing: fall on his face before the Lord and be strengthened. So it's his final preparation, Gethsemane, for the battle, the judgment of the ruler of this world, that he always knew would come. He said in John 12, I love John 12, it's filled with so many wonderful things, but he says here, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then he goes on a few verses later, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. The mystery of Christ revealed at Gethsemane is that the judgment of the ruler of the world, and therefore the judgment of the fallen cosmos itself, is beginning to be accomplished as Jesus takes all of the power's attack and judgment upon himself. In the garden, he's begun to enter into this great battle as the one who will stand alone in our place, absorbing the full onslaught of sin, death, and the enemy. So let me finish up this 2-part kind of mini-series within the series. The final conflict has begun, and now with almost breathtaking speed, events unfold before us. From now on, there's so much packed into every few verses. Something primordial has shifted, and there is no turning back, either for Jesus or for the cosmos itself. We are down to the most basic foundation of conflict. The first blood has been shed, as we noticed.
Yeah, that was good.
The fall in the first garden is about to be reversed, and this begins in the second garden, I'm referring back to last week. When Jesus breaks the power of rebellion by choosing alignment instead of opposition to the divine will, he sets you and me free to live in agreement with the triune God, and therefore to come into all that he has made us to be for all eternity, and to begin to experience heaven now. And that's what I've got to say.
Booyah. Well, I dare not add anything to that. That's marvelous. Folks, I would love to see some of your comments in YouTube. You guys often leave comments. I'd just love to hear just some of what's been really striking you, especially in these last 2 episodes in the garden. Some new takeaways for you or what have you. Let's engage there if we can. Or email us if you're listening to the podcast. Just write to us, podcast@impactnations.com. We'd love to hear from you. Has it been a challenge? I know you're working ahead because, of course, this is a very, very deep work. So you're several weeks beyond here in terms of your preparation. Mm-hmm. You just mentioned breakneck pace. Like now things are really going to start happening quickly in the Passion.
Yep.
Has it been difficult to find your pacing in terms of how much you want to tackle at once?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a challenge. Next week, we're going to look at the arrest. And one little thing we'll see is what's been called the kiss of death, right? And it's not a gangster term. It's a biblical term from history of Judas' kiss. And I'm going to point out something very interesting about that.
I like a good teaser like that. Folks, you're going to have to come back and find out about the kiss of death. You could do that next week. We're here every Thursday. We launch on YouTube every Thursday, and of course on your favorite podcast app if you like to listen to it. So please do subscribe, share it with some friends, and send us some comments. We'd love to hear from you on that. Dad, I wonder if just as we finish, Impact Nations, you started this ministry 20 years ago.
Yep.
I grew up listening to your teaching because you were pastoring for years and years before this, and your life's message was the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we see, you talked again today about the gates of hell were going to push up against it. The kingdom was being, violence was going to be involved. It was going to suffer violence. Now, today, you grieve as you see the brokenness in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Impact Nations has for 20 years been striving to advance the kingdom and shine that light into some real dark places.
Yeah.
As you just continue to go deeper and deeper into the mystery of Christ, really, how has that changed or deepened your understanding of how we identify with the brokenness that we see at Impact Nations? And by brokenness, our listeners, for the most part, I'm sure, are aware. We're just a couple months ago, we got another 520-something kids out of slavery in brick factories. Just a couple weeks ago, I heard about 42 single moms in the slums of Uganda who are having to make some really awful choices in order to provide for their children that are now, they've just encountered Christ, are going to be entering into discipleship relationships and get vocational training so that they've got skills so they can find a dignified way to be able to provide for the children. This is seeing light coming into darkness, but how do you see your brokenness as you identify with the brokenness of others being a driving force of Impact Nations?
Wow. I've never been asked that. Well, I know that my whatever level of compassion I have has steadily, over these last 20 years, become more identificational.
Yeah.
I mean, I really do with these folks. And I understand that sometimes he lets us bring about change. And I love that N.T. Wright says the single best word for salvation is rescue. And sometimes he lets us do that, whether it's clean water or whether it's all these things. But sometimes all we can do is weep with those who weep, and not get frustrated, be in pain, but not feel guilty. Christ, I've now 14, soon 15 years of pursuing the mystery of Christ, and it just grows and grows and grows. And that has changed some of the way I teach. Not so much that I remove stuff, but I've added. And it has let me see that everything we must do must be so grounded in Christ. I love Paul said, I purpose knew nothing among you except Christ crucified. I think off the top of my head, if I had more time, I'd probably, to think about it, I'd give a better answer. But it's this aware of the heart of Jesus in these villages and these brick factories and these places where we go, really aware, not theologically, well, he's with the broken, we know that, but feeling his witness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess that's the answer.
Yeah. Well, if you want to join us in identifying with those who are broken, do that. You can do it in a number of ways. Head to impactnations.com. Learn how to get involved, because that's what we do.
That's what we do.
All over the globe. Impactnations.com. Thanks for being with us this week. Looking forward to learning about the kiss of death next week.
Let's just call it the Judas kiss.
The Judas kiss. We'll see you all next week. Thank you so much. God bless.
Bye-bye.